my name is Terry Kendrick, and I want you all to remember that. I've said it now 3 times.
Wait a minute, what's your name?
Yeah. And welcome to When Commerce and Controversy Collide. I also want to remind folks that if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel's moderator, Ginny Merriam. And Ginny is the Communications Director for the City of Missoula. She's a graduate of the University of Montana School of Journalism. She's a former Missoulian reporter, and she also works as a freelance journalist. And this part I love about her biography is she grew up diagramming sentences. And when I read that, Ginny, I just thought, you needed to get out more. But welcome, Ginny.
It's that University of Montana English Department subversive element in me that it causes the sentence diagramming. Welcome to our panel this afternoon. Our official title here is When Commerce and Controversy Collide, a Conversation. So we have a lot of C's there. I'm hoping for a less formal discussion than our setup would suggest up here, and welcome participation from the audience. Let me introduce you to our panelists today. Our star here is Sherry Jones, who is a journalist and former Missoulian reporter who has written for other newspapers and magazines, including Newsweek and Southwest Art. She's worked for papers around Montana and in other states. Her new novel is The Jewel of Medina. She lives in Spokane. This is our book in question today. Gwen Florio, to my left here, is the city editor at the Missoulian newspaper. She has worked as a national correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, based in Denver, and covered national and international affairs for the Denver Post, and she has worked in Afghanistan and Iraq. Jeff Renz, at the end here, is a professor in the clinical program at the University of Montana School of Law, where he has taught since 1993. He specializes in the areas of civil rights, criminal law, and procedure, and constitutional law. So as I said, I think we're going to try to be a little bit informal here, and I thought we might start by asking Sherry to share with us, sort of tell us how you came to write this novel, and then talk to us about the events surrounding its publication.
Am I on? Oh, I guess I am. Okay, see if I can give you the Cliff Notes version, because I could probably fill a whole book at this point. Another book. I wanted to write about Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the youngest wife of the Prophet Muhammad, after September 11th. I was actually a student at the University of Montana, finishing my bachelor's degree after about 50,000 years of school. And I had an honors thesis that I needed to write for the Davidson Honors College. I was in the creative writing program. I was looking for an idea. I was working on some other thing that I wanted to do, but in the meantime, I was hearing a lot of really unsettling, to me, troubling rhetoric about Muslims and about women in Islam. I was hearing about women in Afghanistan in particular, because we had recently sent troops into Afghanistan, and we're hearing from the media about how women were oppressed so horribly under the Taliban regime, and how they had lost so many of the rights that they had possessed, including the right to an education. So I wanted to learn more for myself about this, and I went to the library. I got a couple of books. One was Geraldine Brooks's book, 9 Parts of Desire, and another book was by Jan Goodwin, called Price of Honor. And they are both books by women journalists who have been in the Middle East, and they talked about the situation of women in the Middle Eastern countries. And both of these books, as I recall, gave me the story of Aisha, how she was 6 years old, according to traditions, when she was engaged to the Prophet Muhammad, who was her father's best friend, who was much older than she. And when she was 9 and he was 53 or 54, she had a wedding ceremony with Muhammad. It was something her father wanted to cement his place as the prophet's chief advisor. Girls, of course, and daughters were, as in many other parts of the world at that time, this is early 7th century Saudi Arabia, they were regarded as property of the father to barter essentially for position or for wealth, status, etc. So against this backdrop, somehow Aisha grew up to become this incredibly self-empowered, uniquely, I think, self-empowered woman. Although we don't really know that for sure because there aren't that many other women whose lives were detailed for us from that time. I do know of a woman named Himmel who saved Muhammad's life with a sword in the battle at Uhud and was actually fighting in that battle. We know that I learned that Muhammad had many wives and concubines, and he respected and treated them with high regard. And he had women in his inner circle of advisors. Women prayed alongside men in the mosques. And as I mentioned, women fought alongside men in the early Islamic battles. And also, Muhammad gave women rights they had never possessed before, such as the right to inherit property, which is something we didn't have in the United States until around the turn of the 20th century. So I was very impressed by this and so excited to tell Aisha's tale. She stood out for me as this remarkable woman. She went on to become a great political leader, political advisor, to the caliphs after Muhammad. And she also was a noted religious scholar, one of the most prominent religious scholars in all of Islamic history. And she could recite, according to tradition, she could recite thousands of poems as well as the entire Quran. And I wanted to tell her story, how she came to be. How did she come to lead troops in the Battle of the Camel against Ali, thereby, starting the Sunni-Shiite split? How did she live such an empowered life, given all her obstacles, being a girl whose life was determined, whose destiny was determined for her by men? So I wrote this book. I researched and wrote for about 5 years, drafted and redrafted, and had the help of some freelance editors and some professors at the University of Montana. And I got an agent pretty quickly, and she got me a deal with Random House pretty quickly. They bid against, there was going to be an auction. Random House preempted the auction with a very generous $100,000 advance for 2 books. The first book, Jewel of Medina, which chronicles Aisha's life until she was 19 and Muhammad dies. And then the sequel is her life after his death, culminating in the Battle of the Camel. Random House, the editors there were very excited about my book. They had me on the fast track to bestsellerdom. They got Book of the Month Club to sign on to feature me in their August catalog. They had Quality Paperback Book Club signed on to come out with their own edition in February of 2009. We had endorsements. We had, they were planning an 8-city tour for me and all kinds of great things. And they wanted to sort of highlight all the historical research that had gone into my book, because I did read at least 30 books, everything I could find in English about Muhammad, Aisha, even if, by Muslims, by non-Muslims, by scholars, by lay people, everything I could find. I took a class at the University of Montana with Murday Kia. I studied Arabic. And so they sent my book thinking that, they could get some endorsements from scholars saying my book is really well researched, that this would give me a little oomph in the market, and also they were hoping my book would be used at universities as a, in Middle Eastern studies classes. So they sent my advanced reading copies out to some various scholars that I recommended, including a scholar named Denise Spellberg. She is a Middle Eastern Studies professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and she wrote a book called Politics, Gender, and the Islamic Past, The Legacy of Aisha bin Abi Bakr. And it was one of many books that I used in my research. It was one of the first books I read, and I thought that she would possibly like what I had, how she had influenced my work. Unfortunately, on May 2nd of this year, I got a call from my agent saying that Denise Spellberg had quite the opposite reaction from what I had hoped. She had, according to the email that I got a copy of, she had called her editor at Random House and said that my book was a declaration of war, that it was more dangerous than the Satanic Verses or the Danish cartoons, and that my book would provoke rioting by radical Muslims and acts of violence. And the next morning, the day I got the phone call, Random House also received a letter from Professor Spellberg's lawyer. I don't know, I never got to see it, but my agent told me that she'd been told that, among other things, Professor Spellberg said that if her book were associated with mine in any way, including, I presume, being listed in the bibliography, that she would sue Random House because she feared for her safety and the safety of her family in East Texas, and that if Random House published my book, that she would not want them to publish her book because she didn't want to be associated in any way with the publishing house because she was so afraid. Of course, a few weeks later, I discovered online that she had actually called and alerted Shahed Amanullah, who is the editor of altmuslim.com and a progressive Muslim, told him about my book, said it was incredibly offensive, and that she wanted him to alert Muslims, the Muslims on his listserv, that this book was coming. So I'm not sure how afraid Ms. Spellberg really was. But anyway, so Random House sent my book out to, they told me at the time, I called my editor, I said, what's happening? And she sounded like this. And I knew at that point that my book was going to be dead in the water at Random House. She said, I can't tell you what they're talking about around here, but we're going to postpone while we get some other opinions. So we waited a few weeks, and then it turns out, well, we got a phone call. My agent and I did a conference call with Elizabeth McGuire, the associate publisher at Random House, and she said that they had sent my book out to 3 more academics, that 2 of them apparently had concerns that Muslims would be offended by my book, while Ms. Spellberg was alarmed by what she called the sexual content of my book, which really had me scratching my head because I really toned down a lot of the stuff that, the Hadith say about Muhammad and his wives. I toned it down because I wanted my book to be PG-13, so teenage girls could read it, and also out of a respect that I developed for Muhammad and Aisha and Muhammad's other wives. So these other professors did not mention apparently sexual content. They were concerned with the way I portrayed some of the characters, or the fact that I even portrayed Muhammad fictionally could be offensive. And I don't know if anyone warned of violence. I never got to see their analyses. I just know that one person predicted a possible heated response. Random House also consulted with the head of security, who had been on some kind of threat call in Random House Canada, and he said he would really rather not deal with this here in the United States. So they decided to postpone publication of The Jewel of Medina and the sequel indefinitely. And I, at that point, almost instantly made the decision to cancel my contract with Random House, thinking that I would easily get another publisher. After the story broke, we had lots of interest from all the major U.S. publishers in New York, and one on the West Coast, or 2 on the West Coast. However, almost everyone who backed out or who declined said that someone on the editorial staff was afraid of reprisal from terrorists. And this was because of, if Random House, if it's too big, if it's too scary, if it's too hot for Random House, then we can't handle this either, basically. We had several smaller publishers interested, and we chose Beaufort Books because of their demonstrated courage in coming out with the controversial O.J. Simpson book, If I Did It. And I have not regretted that. Since then, there's been a lot of rhetoric on the web, especially out of the UK. A lot of a few radical or very conservative Muslims have really, I've been called an enemy of Islam. I've been called an Islamo-panderer, on the other hand, by people who don't like Muslims. So, as a journalist, I feel like maybe I've done a good job, because when you make both sides mad, then you've probably done a good job. So, and my book has come under a lot of scrutiny by Muslims, which I actually am fine with. Muslims don't like historical fiction. They don't like the fiction part of my book. And they are offended that I have many Muslims, not all. And in fact, I would say that in America, Shahed Amanullah, I can never say his name, Shahed Amanullah told me that he has been met with a collective shrug from the American Muslim community. It's just not that big a deal for most American Muslims. But it does seem to be a big deal for Muslims, especially for some Muslims, especially in the UK, who I guess just haven't, I don't know, I'm not sure. I was told by a German reporter that there are a lot of immigrants. They're not really used to, the Western culture, and something like historical fiction is new to a lot of people from other Islamic cultures. So now my book has been published October 6th by Beaufort Books. My UK publisher, Martin Renz at Gibson Square, had a frightening and unfortunate incident. He was set to come out with my book, and 3 men, ages ranging in age from about 22 to 40, Muslim men, approached his home office in the middle of the night a few weeks ago and put some kind of incendiary device in through the letter slot of his home office. Scotland Yard was already aware that there was a sort of a sting operation. They were just waiting for these guys to do this. Somehow Scotland Yard had known about it. And Mr. Renz was not there at the time when it happened. He was never in danger. Of course, the British press have called it a firebombing and an assassination attempt. We don't know if these guys were linked to anything bigger because they haven't had a trial yet, or if they were just 3 guys acting on their own. But for a while, it did heat up the rhetoric. Is Sherry Jones going to die? Is there going to be terrorist attacks against the publishers and against Sherry Jones? But now things seem to be calming down a little bit. But I've learned, if I haven't learned anything else from this experience, I've learned to take each day as it comes, and that I'm not in control. So that's all I have to say. Oh, and also the book is now published. We've sold rights. My agent has sold rights in, besides the United States, 17 other countries.
So I'd be interested in hearing from all 3 of you your opinions about, is Random House's action, is that self-censorship, and is it dangerous or prudent in the precedent it sets?
Yes. And actually, in some ways, yes to all 3. I think it is self-censorship, and I think self-censorship is dangerous. It has a chilling effect. It really disturbs me when something like this happens. Given the very real fact that people have been killed in other incidents, I understand their impulse. But we do dangerous things every day. We get on airplanes that may blow up. We go through quite a bit of security in the hope that that won't happen. We get in our cars and drive. We take risks, and in the world the way it is, some of the risks that we take, especially if we're traveling in other places, may involve terrorism. We do it anyway. And I think that is what Random House should have done. They should have taken the risk. They should have taken some prudent precautions that you do. There was talk about security at this event and other events. You keep an eye out and you go on, because I think the alternative is just too chilling for words. I don't even want to think about. One of my experiences, one of the things that really came home to me traveling in other countries was that you have a very severely curtailed press. I don't want to live in a country like that. And that's just a short yes to all 3, but I feel strongly about all of these things.
Well, first of all, I see about 5 people sitting in the back, and I see about 5 seats in front of me. So before I start talking, come on and sit down. And second thing I want to do is thank Humanities Montana for putting on this panel, and of course for sponsoring the festival of the book over all these years. I guess I would say it's not self-censorship. It's censorship of the author. It's not censorship of Random House.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Random House's primary interest in the book is commercial, and that they are free as a publishing house to weigh the risks to them as they see them, whether we agree with that measurement of the risk or not. This is not, by the way, a First Amendment issue because we're talking about a private publisher.
Yeah, and I that's a good point. And I guess what I would say is that when a publisher does that, then you might get people who are afraid to write about certain subjects. They think twice. They think, well, maybe I won't really go there after all. I was thinking about this on the way over. One of the things that amused me is that the big play this weekend in Missoula is Jesus Christ Superstar. Amazing controversy when it came out. Now it's being shown, at the Children's Theater? Sometimes it's good to keep perspective about these things that were once so controversial and now are matter of course.
I believe that Random House did censor themselves, and this is why. Because no one has told me I can't write this book. And in fact, Random House, they chose my book, yes, commercial, but also because of its literary merits. I mean, that's the job of the editors, to choose, if they like a book, if they think it has literary value, they will publish it. People have to like the book. And Random House, my editors at Random House loved my book. And they, ultimately the decision not to publish had nothing to do with the literary merits of the book. It was pure fear. And I think that when you make a decision out of fear not to publish, then you are censoring yourselves. And Random House, I don't feel that they censored me because I got published anyway. I could have gone online and published my book. No one could stop me. I'm not in fear. I'm not under the threat of being arrested. We're not under a totalitarian regime where certain topics can't be written about or you're going to be going to jail. So I never really felt censored. I had people saying that to me. Oh, they're censoring you. Don't you feel censored? To me, Random House, they have now set a boundary for themselves about what they will and won't publish. It's a boundary that didn't exist before. And to me, that is a form of self-censorship. And I do think that it's dangerous if for no other reason, purely by virtue of the fact that they are the world's largest English language publisher. So now the field is really narrowed for those of us who want to explore books with Islamic themes, or who want to write books with Islamic themes, who want to explore these kinds of potentially provocative topics in our work.
And is that something you're concerned about happening, either of you, that there will be fewer of these books? I look at the Publishers Marketplace list every day, and there are still a fair amount of books, both novels and nonfiction, coming out with Muslim themes. So I don't...
How many of those depict Muhammad as a person?
Yeah, not any that I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah.
However, and this is a personal thing, and I'll get you for this, Sherry. My agent is shopping a novel now that's set in Afghanistan, and it has an Afghan man as a main character. And the rejection I got this week was, given these times, no one wants to read a book about someone like this. I went, just tell me it's bad, But
Well, now I know of some other books that have not been published. I will say that I heard from an agent in France that there is a very popular novel in, I believe, UK, France, and Germany about Turkish transvestite dancers, or Turkish transvestites. Anyway, and it's a comic novel. It's sort of a murder mystery, and each of the different transvestites has a different prophet's name, and they're picked off one by one. And it's a hugely popular novel in those countries, and Penguin had a contract for the US and they canceled it. Now, whether that has anything to do with Muhammad, I don't know, but the French the French agent definitely thought so. And also there was an author in the Spokane area who happens to share my agent. Her name is Nikki Arana. She's an award-winning Christian romance novelist. She has won the highest award, the Dove Award or something, for romance, Christian romance fiction. And she is really into, her personal thing, I had dinner with her, is evangelizing Muslims and, converting them to Christianity. And she has written a Christian romance novel in which that very thing happens. There is a conversion of a Muslim to Christianity. And she has not been able to find a publisher for this book. And it has nothing to do with the quality of her work. It's got to be fear.
But then you get into reality again, which is that in Afghanistan, I think just this past week, a Christian aid worker was killed, and Christian aid workers are routinely targeted. And there's an interesting question here, where to draw the line. I don't particularly think you should, but the question's out there.
That's true, and in Central Asia,
Right.
Christian missionaries are prohibited altogether.
Right.
And they operate as business incubators or
Right.
aids to people in prison, but setting up their own chapels for themselves, which is allowed, and that's the way they sort of work under the radar. So apostasy, of course, is punishable by death. So conversion from
Right.
Islam to any other religion is
Right.
is not a popular thing.
Another form of something else that could be considered self-censorship, I think, are some disturbing reports I've been hearing. I haven't verified them, but I have gotten a couple of reports of people trying to find my book at Barnes & Noble and having a very difficult time. Instead of displaying my book along with other new releases, new fiction releases, some Barnes & Noble stores apparently, reportedly, are choosing to display maybe a single copy, but they don't even display it. They shelve it in some obscure spot, is what I've been told. I've heard this is also true of the Missoula Barnes & Noble, that there is one copy of my book that's visible and that it's kind of hard to find. And so, to me, the woman who wrote to me about her experience, not in Missoula, but at a different Barnes & Noble store, of trying to find my book, said the manager told her they had 3 copies of my book left in the store. They had originally had only 7. They had 3 left in the store. They had put them in obscure locations purposely so that so as not to draw attention to my book. They didn't want controversy. She said she bought a copy and she was admonished by the store manager. She left to put it in a bag or keep it out of sight. So, there is a lot of fear. I mean, and what's really interesting is that, we haven't heard any outrage from the American Muslim community. But people are still afraid of possible retaliation of some kind.
Why should we hear outrage?
He asked, why should we hear outrage? Well, in my opinion, we shouldn't. I mean, there's nothing, in my opinion, my book it honors Aisha, and it honors Muhammad. I found Muhammad to be an honorable figure. As I've pointed out, he was very progressive when it came to women. He was very peaceful man. I mean, he had to fight in self-defense. It was tribal warfare culture that he lived in, and he was constantly under the threat of assassination because he dared to exercise his own freedom of speech. However, I also know that, I have learned recently that, that there are some conservative Muslims who are outraged, as I said, because my book is fiction, not only because of the details of the book, the tales of what's regarded as history. However, even Denise Spellberg says in the prologue to her book, or the preface to her book, nothing was ever even written down about Aisha until 150 years after she died. That's like today, if we went back to a woman in the 1850s, there were no written journal entries, no written anything about her. All we had was word of mouth. Then they start writing things down based on what's been told about her. And so, is there a definitive history of Aisha? And, having read that in Denise Spellberg's book, I'm thinking, well, gee, you know, the little bit of history that's available that you can actually read, supposedly written history by, you know, scholars, things that have been, the Hadith, they don't even agree. I mean, even the historical accounts that exist aren't in agreement. But however, many Muslims grow up with their stories of Aisha and their image of Aisha, their imaginations, their ideas of who she was. And because my book deviates from their imaginations and their ideas, then it's offensive. So that's been one source of outrage, but mostly, the most of the controversy happened before the book was even published, because when Asra Nomani broke the story for the Wall Street Journal about Random House's backing out of the deal, she interviewed Denise Spellberg, and Denise Spellberg said, "You can't take sacred history and turn it into soft pornography." Well, you know, you can well imagine the reaction in the conservative, especially conservative Muslim community, to the notion that I had written a pornographic book about the Prophet Muhammad and his wives. And I spent countless hours, I exhausted myself defending my book against those charges. Now the book is out and critics are reading it and writing about it, and whether they like my book or not, Muslim and non-Muslim, you know, they're agreeing that my book doesn't even have any sex scenes in it. There's sexuality because Muhammad, as he insisted in the Quran, he said, "I am but a mortal being." He was a man, he was a mortal man, "I am but a mortal man," he said, and you know, I took him at his word, and I tried to create characters who were well-rounded. And you have a story of a man and his 12 wives and concubines, there's going to be sexuality, there's going to be sexual rivalry among the wives, and some have found this offensive also.
Well, I think the outrage ought to be in the sense that the offense that was taken was to the rumor that was spread on the internet, and that the criticism about the book was made mostly by people who hadn't even seen the book. Denise Spellberg, before she became a national security expert last spring, was one of the few people who had read the book. One thing I want to ask the audience is, how many of you have read the book from cover to cover? I see one hand and two hands and three hands. Yeah. You know, I would never have read this book, but for the controversy. I don't particularly like the book. It's not my genre, for one thing. It's not the sort of thing I read. Somebody calls it chick lit online, and I think I would call it teen chick lit. You know, I think it is a nice depiction of Muhammad. As I read the book, I started writing down adjectives that I think might describe him in terms of how Sherry Jones treated him, and those were devout, gentle, harsh, compassionate, merciful, kind, patient, courageous amidst great odds, loving, and very wise. I did not find Aisha very sympathetic at all. She was petulant for the entire 8 years until she sort of reaches this moment of conversion from child to woman that takes place in the book. But we have to recognize that everything that Sherry Jones has said about Aisha, except for the facts that take place in the background, is absolutely pure fiction, absolutely total speculation. And it's total speculation from a Western perspective, not from a West Asian perspective. And so we also need to understand, because it's not from a West Asian perspective, not from a perspective that understands tribalism at its very roots, not from a perspective that understands sort of in a cultural historical sense what was taking place, that someone who has that perspective could be offended by it. Now, the fact that somebody is offended by it, you know, there are a lot of things that offend us. The question is, how do we react to that offense? And that's really what is different.
Gwen, I'd be interested in hearing from you some context that you could give us based on your work in Afghanistan and Iraq. I assume that you are, you know people there. Can you imagine conversations that might be taking place about this book and culturally where they would come from?
Boy, that's a good question. Most of the people I talk to, I can't imagine any of them reading it. I don't think the book is available there, for starters. And I think, just as you would in this country, you'd get a very wide range of opinion. I think it would be enormously offensive to some people. I think some people might like it, some people might not care. I think the thing that I find distressing about a lot of the discussion, and as Jeff pointed out, so much of that has been uninformed discussion on the internet based by people who don't really know much about it, is it sort of reinforces this caricature of Muslims that seems to be fairly widespread in this country, to the point where, you know, Obama's handlers felt he couldn't even have the two women in headscarves sitting behind his podium at one of his events. That is so painful to hear. Again, my own experience is my experience was a Westerner there, and I heard opinions across the board. I met women who were phenomenally oppressed. I met women who were phenomenally impressive and powerful. My favorite phrase I heard there among women, they would ask me repeatedly, "Do you have a cooperative husband?" I went, huh? Our word for that is whipped. But the whole context being, if you had a supportive husband, you could be whatever you wanted to be, and I met many women who did have very supportive husbands. So I'm not answering your question at all. I'm just saying it's as varied a culture as you might expect it to be when you stop and think about it, and so I imagine the responses would be as varied as they would be here.
I lived off and on for over 6 months in the city of Osh in southern Kyrgyzstan, which is near the Uzbek border, and Kyrgyzstan is an overwhelmingly Muslim country, as is Uzbekistan. And of course, I can tell you that I walked past the pool in Osh, and it was filled with young girls in bikinis. On the other hand, when you walk past the mosque in Osh on a Friday, the old Uzbek men would scowl and make comments about women who didn't wear their dresses long enough. So, I mean, it's a huge mixture of viewpoints. And of course, you know, that part of Central Asia that I was in was under Soviet control and Russian control for over 150 years, so it was a lot more cosmopolitan, relatively speaking. But the tribal relationship still persist, and the patrilineal sort of power still persists. There are no women in the no, there's one woman now in the Kyrgyz parliament. So it depends upon where you go and who's there.
But I think the important thing to note about this is we're talking about these big cultural varieties and about a lot of things that are very controversial. There's been a lot of controversy about the treatment of women in these countries. That's pretty widely written about. Maybe not so widely there, but it is written about, it is acknowledged, people talk about it. It's not like there's a lid on stuff. It's, again, not as widely publicized as it might be here, but it's out there. You know, in Kabul now there are internet cafes. People, you know, you had the specter of the Taliban in their caves on sat phones and with laptops. It's a pretty connected world now.
I'd like to talk for a minute about censorship, because, you know, really, I think that the biggest issue that this controversy of my book, published or not, like my book or not, the biggest issue that I think it's brought to the fore is, you know, can a minority, a really small minority of people in the world, because they are threatening violence, are they going to be able to tell the rest of us what we can and cannot read, what we can and cannot say, what we can and cannot think, what we can and cannot believe? Now, I want to tell you what I consider an extremely inspiring story to come out of all this. In Serbia, my book was published in middle of August. It was the first, Serbian Bayo book was the first publisher in the world to come out with my book. He published 1,000 copies. It's a pretty small country. Printed 1,000 copies, sent it out to bookstores. 2 days after it appeared in the bookstores, a very conservative mufti, Islamic leader, issued a protest against my book, demanding that it be removed from the bookstores. He even asked that all the copies of the book be sent to him, apparently so he could burn them. He said that the book contained scenes of brutal pornography and that it was degrading to Muhammad and Aisha. So obviously he had not read the book. So the publisher, being intimidated, agreed readily to accede to this mufti's demands. He announced that he was ceasing publication, that he would be withdrawing the books from the bookstores. This is on Saturday. However, on Monday, when he went to get them, there were none left. My book remained in limbo in Serbia for about a month. In the meantime, newspapers in Serbia began their anti-censorship campaign. There were articles, there were letters to the editor, there were opinion pieces, there were readership polls and surveys. The newspapers reported quite tirelessly on this issue. And I was told by the associate editor at Blitz Daily in Belgrade that he said, we had it very difficult under Slobodan Milosevic, and we're not going to give up our freedom of speech, that easily. So they still remember when they didn't have any freedom of speech. And so even the newspapers contacted a moderate Muslim mufti, the rival with the conservative guy. And he said, we don't really even agree with this book. We don't really like it, but we would not say it should be banned. We think it should be published so people can decide for themselves. Then 8 NGOs who had been very supportive and influential, supportive of Muslims during the Balkan conflict, they issued a joint statement calling upon this conservative mufti to apologize to the Serbian people for censoring them. Of course, the conservative mufti then came out and blamed the press, said he'd been misrepresented. And my book started being sold on the streets, bootleg editions for twice the price the publisher had been asking, which killed him. He just couldn't stand it. So he ended up reissuing the book. And he printed 3,000 for a second printing, and it sold out in 2 days. And now, last I heard, my book, a month ago, was #1 in Serbia. I don't know if it still is. But it was about to go into its 4th printing. Yeah, and this is a testament to the power of the people. To me, this is a testament to the power of the people. It's not about my book. It's about the power of the people. We can't be silent. We can't, silence is consent. And if we just, if we do like Random House and we retreat and we withdraw, then, we might lose it.
Can I ask you a question? I just want to address your comment about Random House, because I'm a publisher of Random House, and I'm under the impression that it wasn't Random House, the corporation, that refused to publish the book, that it was your own publisher, Little Random House. And each publisher has the right to do whatever, make decisions in the company. And I just wanted to clarify, because it's not the entire corporation. It's not that big of a house. I'm not defending them or not, and I haven't read the book. But it wasn't the entire.
No, it was. My book was going to be published by Ballantine, not the Little Random House.
But Ballantine is part of Little Random House.
Well, the president and the CEO, Gina Centrello, made the decision.
Right. Gina Centrello is the publisher of Random House, but Random House is one little piece of the corporation. Knopf is another group. I'm another group. Double is another.
Okay.
It's a little piece of Random House. When you say Random House, it's not the entire New York, the force, the conglomerate, force. It was your publisher, Gina Centrello.
Well, thank you for clarifying that for me. I was not as familiar with the corporate structure there, and I appreciate that.
And I do want to comment on the irony of attempts at suppression of expression. And the great and wonderful irony is that they usually stimulate sales, whether it's books or tickets or whatever. They stimulate sales. If you want to suppress a book, the best thing to do is to ignore it. And I think that's always probably been true. And
Well,
that would probably be the greatest insult to you of all.
I did think about throwing a little Muhammad scene in my novel. Just a short one. Actually, the one thought I had, we've been talking about a very tiny, violent minority suppressing speech, suppressing, free discussion of ideas, but to me, that's not the biggest concern. The biggest concern is passivity among people who accept the sort of slow gnawing away at speech, at rights, at things we've seen in this country, where now you do surveys and people say, oh, the press shouldn't be allowed to print those things that they print because they could be dangerous. That disturbs me far more, is that there's an acceptance of a certain level of, and again, it almost goes back to self-censorship. I think that's more dangerous or more insidious.
Mm-hmm. I do too. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm wondering, are there questions for any of our panelists? Yes, you in the back there? Just stand up and shout it out.
I'll do my best. 4 years ago at this event, a rather bigger name author who was invited was disinvited from reading his selection because it was assumed it would offend the funders and the other people participating in the event. I'm curious, are there insights we can learn from Sherry's experience about taming the conservative impulses in our own progressive, liberal, pro-intellectual community?
One of you want to take that one on?
You.
You're the lawyer.
You make a stink about it. No, I'm serious. You make a stink about it is what you do. And you embarrass the people who are attempting to suppress that expression. And it's only by making a stink about it that you sort of remind people that there are other principles floating around out there other than not offending someone.
Thank you. Other question here?
Were you really surprised that there were demonstrations around the world when the book was published?
She asked if I'm surprised there were demonstrations around the world when the book was published, but there have not been demonstrations. I was never surprised by the controversy. In fact, my editor, Ginny Sternlight, called me from before she made an offer on my book to ask me about my expectations for controversy. I said to her, there's nothing in my book of substance that you can't find somewhere in nonfiction. And so, perhaps I was somewhat naive in that regard, although most of the controversy hasn't really centered around the book itself. I want to repeat that. There's been, the book itself has stimulated a lot of debate and discussion so far, a lot of debate and discussion, and a lot of trashing of my book by people who don't like the liberties I've taken with what they consider the historical record. However, the controversy has been around a blank text that people have been able to project their own fears, hostilities, angers, etc. onto because of one woman's use of the word pornography. So that's what has stimulated the controversy. The book has not had much of a chance to cause any trouble on its own yet.
Further questions?
My question is more in the religious area. It seems like what passes for what might have used to be called the ecumenical movement or religious tolerance, whether it's within Christianity in our society or within multiple world religions within our society of the world, that there's somewhat of an agreement to all pat each other on the back and kind of say everything's okay and it's nice and those are just a few people off the side. And so it seems like we dumb down thoughtful conversation about whether a lot of religious things make a damn bit of sense. And worse than that, not only whether they make a damn bit of sense, I say this with masters in Christianity, but I mean, there's an awful lot of things in most religions that make no sense whatsoever. We all agree not to say that about one another, because then they could say the same thing about us. But now it's risen to the level of violence, and there's many kinds of violence. I just finished reading Leaving the Saints by a woman who spoke of sexual abuse in her family and within the LDS church and everything. And she was threatened with death and everything else, but basically it was the violence of exclusion, the violence that you don't exist any longer. In your case, it's more the violence of we're going to kill you if you write something about our prophet or something like this. These things don't make sense. Why aren't religious leaders speaking up? Why aren't political leaders speaking up? Why aren't others? Not so much only about your book, but in the broader sense. That some things don't make sense. A lot of us know they don't make sense, but somehow there seems to be a collusion, even if unorganized, in not speaking up in the main about things like this.
I can't speak to religious leaders, but I can say that there are some prominent Muslim women in the United States who have been speaking up. Asra Nomani, who wrote the op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal, "You Still Can't Write About Muhammad," which was about what happened to my book, she speaks up. She's written her own book called Standing Alone about her efforts to get equal access to her mosque in her hometown of Morgantown, West Virginia. Her unsuccessful efforts, by the way. And Urshad Manji is another progressive lesbian, feminist Muslim, American Muslim. And she is very outspoken about freedom of speech. She has a project called the Moral Courage Project at New York University, I believe, and she is, it's a anti-censorship program. She works with young people a lot. So there are some, for example, I know in the moderate Muslim community, there are some who are speaking out, but I have, once again been very surprised at how small the number is, considering that moderate Muslims are by far the majority in the world, and especially in the United States, but we just don't hear that much. I don't know if they're not organized very well, or if they're afraid to, or if they just don't care. I don't really know. I do hope that they will rise, moderate Muslims, because I know, how many of us doesn't, I imagine we all know moderate Muslims here in Missoula. There are people who are just really devout, pious, wonderful, tolerant, forgiving, accepting, loving people who are not violent and don't like the violence that's been associated with their religion. So, I hope that, people will speak out about that. People will speak out for their own group.
It sounds to me as if mainstream Muslim community could take offense at all that you depicted Muhammad in a fictional way at all, and that's a problem. Were you aware that depicting him fictionally was a problem when you began the book? And if you had not, and if you had known the kind of reaction that it might have inspired, do you think you would have gone with this project?
Yes, I would have. I was so passionate to write about Aisha and bring her story to the world, and I felt that fiction was the vehicle, because in fiction you can, in fiction you can provide empathy for the reader into a character that I just have never gotten from a book of nonfiction. But I do want to say that my book is not the first book about Aisha or Muhammad, and it's not the last novel. I haven't read it because I didn't want it to influence my book. There are 2 books, actually, that I can think of that predated my book. One is listed in the University of Montana card catalog. They're not called card catalogs anymore, but you know what I mean. They're catalogs. It's a book, it's a fiction. Apparently, according to the catalog, it's a novel, fictional account of Muhammad. It's called, I believe, Muhammad. And then there is a book by a woman named Assia Jabbar. She, I believe, is Moroccan. She's a scholar. She's an author, novelist. She's a Renaissance woman. She does it all. And she's written a book called Out from Medina. It's a fictional account of Aisha and other important women in Muhammad's life. So, I learned there is a novel published about Aisha in France this past spring. the cover looks sort of similar to mine, and, you know, with a full face woman, and I was told that she's depicted as a sensual, lusty woman, and in her book, and I never heard any controversy about it, or about the book The Messenger, published in the Netherlands this year, that sold 75,000 copies in hardback in a small country like that. It's hugely popular, about Muhammad and Aisha. This spring, Simon & Schuster will publish, their Atria division will publish Mother of the Believers by Kamran Pasha, a Pakistani-American screenwriter, about Aisha. So, you know, I didn't feel like I was necessarily breaking new ground, although the only new ground I felt that I was breaking was that most people I knew had never heard of Aisha. And yes, in my first book, she's a teenager, and it's her coming-of-age tale. And if I were a girl in a harem competing with 11 other wives and concubines for the attention of the man I loved, I'd be petulant too. The sequel is where she really does come into her own as a woman. And so, you know, and so my books, that's how they're breaking new ground. I'm hoping that they're putting Aisha on the lips, they're putting the name Aisha on the lips of Americans and of people around the world who've never heard of her before. And for that I feel like I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
How far are you with your second book?
My second book is, hi Mia. My second book is finished, and I just submitted it, the final finished product to my publisher, Beaufort Books, and they're my German publisher, Pindo, I forget the name. Anyway, Pindo Verlag. They're very interested in possibly publishing that book in the spring. And I think that Beaufort Books is going to work on it, not crashing it out the way they did this one, but on an accelerated schedule to try to accommodate that. So that's very exciting for me too.
Thank you all for joining us today for this good discussion.